In the 19th century, the population of British India became exhausted of the problems that arose while living under British rule.
After decades of crushing any movement towards Indian independence, post-war Britain had neither the will nor the might to hold on to its colony. Across a newly drawn border, leaders celebrate the birth of the Republic of India. Freed from colonial rule, the creation of these two countries completes a long struggle for independence.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge.
By 1946, any hope of a united India had evaporated.
Order was restored, but beneath the surface, enmity between Muslim and Hindu.
The breakdown at the top of Indian politics was mirrored on the streets as tensions spilled over into violence. Chaos erupted in major cities.
First pictures of the grim ordeal faced by British and Indian troops during the worst riots in the history of Calcutta. Fires raged unchecked in many places, while pitched battles continued between Muslims and Hindus.
Hindus and Muslims constructed majority of the population in this country, and a great amount of tension existed between them. As a result, the decision was made to divide British India into two states, separating majority of Muslims in Pakistan and majority of Hindus into India as best they could. The partition caused millions of people to abandon their hometowns and migrate to unfamiliar lands, causing violence and unrest. A majority of the people living in British India were impacted negatively during the partition, but women and children experienced these impacts in a way unlike anyone else.
The massive outbreak of violence against women in both India and Pakistan was a product of the partition between the two regions. Preceding the actual partition, men from all religions on both sides of the border were using women as geopolitical statements. Now, this doesn't mean that women were viewed as international political issues, but they were viewed the same as territory and property. Women were given possessive titles such as ours and theirs, which led to demonstrations of dominance between Muslim and Sikh men. Because of the label of territory hanging over women, men would violate their enemies' female relatives and partners to make a statement and mark their territory. Their main method of violating their enemies was to rape their women and children. Some men would mutilate women, strip them of their clothes, and make them parade around for them just to humiliate them. When mutilating these women, certain mutilations were given meanings. For example, cutting a pregnant woman's stomach open was a slight against a father because it was stripping him of his title as father and husband. If they amputated a breast, it was defeminizing, therefore taking away her title as a wife or mother. At a certain point, rape became an inevitable thing that they thought could only be avoided by suicide or intentional homicide by another male relative. If the men of the family knew a mob was coming to rape the woman, they would sometimes attempt to save their female relatives by beheading, stabbing, burning, or shooting them. They believed this to be a preservation of their honor. Women also took this into their own hands by committing suicide rather than to be taken into enemy hands. Women often drowned themselves and lit themselves on fire. It is believed that poor women were more susceptible to this treatment because they had to primarily walk by foot everywhere they went, which left them vulnerable to kidnapping, while women of higher class and wealth could afford transportation via cars and other such vehicles. In the Sikh religion, the concept of a woman burning oneself was known as jihar, which was the concept of how it was honorable for women to kill themselves if they had husbands or boyfriends at war to avoid being appropriated by other men. It was preferred for a woman to do this to themselves to prevent a life of suffering and being taken advantage of without having control of their life. Sardar Joginder Singh Kohli was a teenage boy that had migrated to Punjab during the time of post-partition. As a Sikh, he and others who shared his beliefs were particularly vulnerable in the Punjab during the 1940s. A young Sikh woman named Veer Wali was one of the thousands who performed jihar to save herself from a life of torture.
And he still remembers how Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs turned on each other.
और साढ़े पिंड का ही वाकया है वीरा वाली सी और विडो सी शी वॉज वेरी वेरी ब्यूटीफुल मुसलमान ने बड़ी निगाह से उससे क्योंकि मुसलमान बुरा करके आए अजे लैन वास्ते मैंने चुक के ले जाइए वो साढ़े पिंड गुरुद्वारा सी गुरुद्वारे की कार चली गई गुरुद्वारे जाके उन्हें संतोख किया और सौंक के उसके बाद मिट्टी से तेल पा के कपड़ा में वो सड़ गई उन्हें अगा दी खुद से सड़ गई मैं अपनी अखी देखा उस वक्त में बड़ गया उस वक्त में बड़ी लोग असल गल ये कि और ख्याल होना है समझदार कि इंसानियत तो नहीं रही हर आदमी गैर हो गया दुष्ट हो गया.
The partition of India constituted some of the most violent war crimes to date, and women were victims of some of the most horrific crimes and treatment. Women's honor, humanity, and lives were threatened daily, both emotionally and physically. Many times their morals were called into question, and they had to decide whether to live and be harmed in the most unimaginable ways, or stain their honor, which went against Jahar, which was a belief system made by the Sikhs.
During the partition, children's experiences differed. Some factors that could determine parts of their life in the 1940s are their age, their religion, the location of their home, and their family situation. First of all, the gender of a child was the main factor. If the child was a boy, they would automatically be more acknowledged as part of the family. If they became abducted, they would be used as soldiers in killing sprees for their abductors. On the other hand, if a girl was to be abducted, they were often sold into prostitution or used for other similar services, mostly in a position where they would be taken advantage of. Females were generally targeted more than males, and the ways they were treated were extremely inappropriate. Additionally, when it comes to the religion of a child, it is believed that Muslims set out to abduct mostly Hindu and Sikh boys, thinking that they were smarter than Muslims. For young girls, though, it did not really matter what religion they were because they were not being scouted for their skill levels in any areas. Many children's pain and death was the result of groups that did not get along, whether it was religious unrest or not. If a woman had children after she was abducted, they were not acknowledged as legitimate, never saw their mothers again, and were forced to stay with their birth fathers as citizens of their birthplace. If they were pregnant when they were abducted, they were required to sacrifice their child up to adoption or to have an abortion, called the cleansing. Although abortion was illegal, it was arranged by the government, who financed mass abortions for this reason. On September 6, 1947, Salahuddin Khalid lived in New Delhi as a young boy and was part of a Muslim family. British India had just been split into two states, Pakistan and India, and Salahuddin lived with his family in India, the state that was dominated by majority Hindus. On one unexpected day, something happened that would change the way Khalid lived for the rest of his life.
When my mother was saying her prayer, I heard a shriek crying somebody. I turned and I saw a Sikh with a sword in hand coming, and my sister is running. And first they entered the room of my mother, killed her, then they ran toward us.
Saladin fled his home in fear of his life. When he returned, the horror lay in front of him.
When I entered the house, it was just like a, the butcher house, nothing, slaughterhouse. When you see your own mother drenched in blood and stomach open, the intestine coming up, how would you feel?
His words about witnessing his own mother's killing were, "It was just like a slaughterhouse." The thousands of children and their families in similar situations to Khalid did not deserve anything near the terrible violence and aggression that was thrown upon them. Women and children during the 19th century were unjustly put through the traumatic endurance of the consequences that resulted from the creation of the two nations and their religiously separated boundaries. The people that lived through this chaos would spend the rest of their lives reliving the years of witnessing and receiving violence, losing their loved ones, and seeing their fate perish before their eyes.